Hi, everyone. So I guess I'll start us off. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Early. I'm the Operations and Development Coordinator at the One America Movement. Today we have Marcus Coleman with us, and he's so grateful to. We're so grateful to him for giving us his time for this episode of Candid Conversations. So let's just jump right in. So Marcus, you are a Senior Associate at HWC, an organization that's focused on working together to change the world for good.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your role and how you build resilience through your work?
Absolutely, Ryan. Thank you, and thank One America One America movement for inviting me to this conversation. So, I serve as lead for stakeholder engagement and strategic communications here at HWC, which means I work with a lot of partners on issues ranging from communicating what people can do before, during, and after disasters, to ensuring that folks are being able to access and share accurate public health information to care for themselves and others. Very much invested. We talk about changing the world for good, and a lot of that looks at just how can we show up to be better partners for folks that are impacted by different crises. And so a lot of my summer's been very busy with not just the pandemic but some of the other national responses to wildfires, floods, things like that. So
Oh, wow. Thank you. So I'm pretty sure this is like a very critical and crucial time for you, and you're learning a lot and partnering with a lot of people, definitely.
I am, and I appreciate learning a lot from folks. I'm learning more than I'm sharing, for sure.
Are you getting any sleep these days, or?
uh, yes, I am. I am. I'll say not having we are blessed or lucky enough not to have a long commute, so now I just come downstairs and
Okay.
so maybe to catch a few weeks in that way.
Oh, that's good. So you've written a couple of articles where you use the acronym F.A.I.T.H to spell faith to detail what organizations and leaders can do to become more resilient to crises. Can you tell us what faith means, and also how can people use these concepts to navigate through these significant changes in their lives?
Thank you for asking that. It's a very personal. It comes from a very personal place for me. So I had actually worked prior to my role at HWC, worked in the federal government, where I was responsible for helping to shepherd partnerships between faith-based and community groups and the federal government to help solve issues, specifically in that capacity. Again, helping people before, during, and after disasters, and helping to advance efforts to combat human trafficking. So when I talk about keeping the faith or faith, I talk about it as a double entendre, right? So the first interpretation ties back to the Honorable Adam Clayton Powell in one of his speeches, "Keeping the Faith," which is one of my favorite speeches, or John Bon Jovi, depending on like what's your frame of reference or what's most relevant to you when thinking about keeping the faith. The second interpretation is tied to my fundamental belief that when it comes to helping people and communities navigate moments of calm conflict of change, there's 5 components that need to be present at any given time to help make sure that that's a sustained effort. So, ingredient 1, fellowship. So, building social capital is a notable and well researched input as it relates to helping communities bounce back when they face disruptions. And so, having that relationship or being relational pre an incident or pre a disaster definitely helps people navigate those tensions that come immediately after. Appreciative inquiry. So, engaging with the world around you, starting with what you have versus what's missing, is critically important. And I think that we're seeing now, right, that folks are trying to count their blessings and count ways to look at what assets they have to help build communities and keep communities strong. Integrative thinking, which is a term coined by Roger Martin, who's a business strategist, serves as a great choice architecture approach to look at what seems to be very polarized tensions and kind of use those tensions as ways to help frame better questions to get to a mutual objective. Transparency, not just the organizational kind, but the human kind as well. When I speak to transparency, I'm talking about not just sharing information, but also being empathetic with the intent that you have and recognizing that people are going through a lot, which is particularly important through times of crisis. And humble leadership. So it's a field of study of leadership that I see gaining a lot of traction, which makes me very excited. I think that oftentimes as we're talking about some of the challenges we face as a nation and as a nation in the world, being humble about what it means to actually lead and be servants first in the work that we do. And so, taking that fellowship, appreciative inquiry, integrative thinking, transparency, and humility, our humble leadership, is what I talk about when I mean keeping the faith.
Oh, that sounds perfect. It's very succinct too. I guess a follow-up question for you is, given no matter what your ideology is or my ideology is, but the ideology of the executive branch of our government has been, how have you found communities and organizations, faith organizations especially, and other, I guess, crises interventionist organizations? Have you found that the faith has been stronger amongst these organizations, given, I guess, whatever measured approach the federal government has given to the pandemic in these days?
Yes, and I'll say it's been stronger despite some increased challenges. Just of course, that the pandemic has changed a lot of things for a lot of people, and it's had some unfortunate consequences. I've seen some estimates out there that giving to the faith community has decreased by almost 30%. And despite those challenges, I think you still find, particularly communities of faith, finding opportunities to do what they do best, right? If you're talking about the Christian faith specifically, we're talking about commitments of organizations that are feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, doing the things that are necessary to be involved. And the great thing, and I'll say, is you have people continuing to work across faiths. There's an organization that continues to bring me joy and serves as an inspirational example. The National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. It's a collection of organizations that include Islamic Relief USA, the United Methodist Church, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, and they have been leading and serving. They've been around for about 40 years as a collective, but they've been leading and serving throughout this pandemic in ways that unfortunately don't make a lot of the mainstream news, but definitely are helping to keep communities together in a way that I think is going to better serve our nation as we get to the other side of not just the outcome of the presidential election, but of some of the other challenges that come with the pandemic and some of the other disasters we're facing.
So you see an increased role for these organizations post-pandemic and post any administration, you think?
Oh, yes. I was actually had the pleasure to be part of an effort with former White House Executive Director for the White House Office of Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships, Melissa Rogers. And they have laid out some wonderful recommendations in a document called A Time to Heal, A Time to Build, that speaks explicitly to how the incoming administration was built. It was an administration agnostic, but how any administration can build partnerships with faith-based and community groups. And I'll say that you see some foresight and I think some wise leadership from mayors and governors and just that at that local level. I've been very encouraged by the mayors that have made proactive efforts to engage faith communities in some of their recovery-related task forces to the pandemic, and making sure that there's some tangible and substantive seats at the table to building some of those partnerships. And again, there's a lot of questions around the role of church and state and what the government relationship is with faith communities are. But I've been heartened to see that people are making good faith efforts to not just create space to do things that we know houses of worship and faith communities do from a spiritual or emotional care perspective, but more importantly, that there's other ways for them to contribute for some of the practical capacities that they build, including, providing opportunities for others to serve in their communities. So
yeah, and then I definitely look forward to seeing that play out over the next few years. Yeah, definitely. So as we've mentioned, we're going through a very interesting time in our country right now. We just had a pretty tumultuous presidential election, and parts of the country are preparing to shut down again due to COVID-19. Given that you have so much experience in the crisis preparedness space, what advice would you give to Americans as they try to navigate these difficult situations?
So the advice that I'm living by is one, counting my blessings, counting my assets, counting on loved ones, and giving myself permission to find 5% more joy each day. So I am a man of faith. So when we talk about counting blessings, I'm able to, I woke up today. I increasingly, like, my Wi-Fi works consistently. And I know that's not the reality for people, right? But they're also counting on opportunities to be blessings. And so being smart about being, where I can help loved ones, including neighbors and friends there. When we talk about counting assets, I'd say, particularly for those that are in leadership positions or in positions of great influence, continuing to look to find the assets within your community and caring for those that serve in that caregiving capacity. One of the organizations I work with Healthcare Ready, is
Mhm.
very much invested in making sure that, not just people that are medically fragile and socially vulnerable are cared for, but that we think about their, nieces and nephews, or people that are informal caretakers in that network, are aware of what resources and assets are available to them as well. Counting on loved ones, try to Zoom a bit more with family members. My niece's birthday was yesterday, and so I think not forgetting there. And then when we talk about the finding 5% more things that bring you joy, like the reality of it is that while we're in a pandemic, we're witnessing a renewed commitment to neighbor helping neighbor
Mhm.
for long periods of time, and I think that it's important to committing to random acts of kindness to people that are immediately next door to you. So again, I think we see the church here showing up in a big way, and extending their food programs, or finding
Mhm.
new ways to learn and serve the interest of either seniors, or maybe there's folks with access and functional needs that they can show up and support, and from secular based organizations, right? It's not just the faith community that I think are finding different ways to keep communities connected, and using arts and the humanities and some of the things to just remind folks that we are human after all, and that as we're dealing with this challenge, when we get through it, we want to get through it with hopefully a bit more positive relationships to cut through some of the discord that plagues us today.
Yeah, man. I feel like going back to your point about being more neighborly to each other, have you noticed, in even like cities like New York, where you don't talk to your neighbors as much, people have sort of come together? And do you see that that sort of continuing post pandemic, that sort of spirit of being a good neighbor and helping out and getting to know your community a bit more?
I have seen it, and I've experienced it even ourselves. I mean, I'm based in DC,
Hmm.
and admittedly didn't talk to my neighbors much more before the pandemic, but since then, have made some intention, right, in a socially distant manner consistent with public health guidance.
Hmm.
But yeah, just to find new ways to connect with each other. I think there's definitely, I think, a lot of energy that is being built up, that we have an opportunity to kind of keep in place for momentum, as it relates to being more neighborly. I think one of the opportunities that I continue to find, I guess, just hope in, is that that folks are, again, commute patterns are going to change, and so
Hmm.
yeah, hopefully people can find different ways to solve different problems. And what I appreciate is, I think a lot of what's happened as a result of the consequence of this pandemic is folks are becoming more interested in how they can help solve problems around them. Right, so we have a playground up the street from our house, and there's a garden there that's a community garden that really hasn't been cared for as much as we'd like. And one of the things I'm thinking about is, how can we work with our neighbors to bring some vibrancy and energy towards caring for that community garden, and maybe have some more fruits and vegetables that are fresh in our immediate proximity come next
Yeah.
spring. So,
Oh, well, I wish you and your community a bountiful harvest come springtime.
yeah.
So when the COVID-19 pandemic first began, you co-authored an article about how worship and social connection would be changing as a result of the virus. Can you talk to us about the tips that you provided?
Sure. Yeah, and I appreciate it. I was actually able to co-author the piece with Dr. Nicolette Lewis Saint from Healthcare Ready. She's the executive director there. And at the
Okay.
time, we were trying to develop or bring together some practical tips and information for different faiths. At the time, this was right before the high holy days in springtime for many faith traditions. And so wanted to point to some practical and actionable tips for encouraging public health communicators and faith leaders alike to find new ways to keep congregants and communities they serve connected, and also just making sure, right, that there was some of the rituals or things that folks were accustomed to, there clearly adjustments being made, but not having full out, removals or disruptions. So one of the tips that we talked about, and I want to go back to the 30%, is just giving platforms. I think online giving has become more of a necessity for some folks. And I'll say at my home church, New Bethel Baptist Church in DC, they still are receiving snail mail. So our pastor, we attend service virtually every Sunday still. And he's very much like, we know that some people are committed to dropping the envelope off at the church. And while we want to create the opportunity to do that, we want to also let you know, right, that there's different ways to give. But we also see some tips, I think, in how people are conducting service activities. And so what is true for people of faith and for the churches of their activities are not just manifested on their days of worship. Again, I want to point back to some of the work for Islamic Relief,
Mhm.
and the work that they're doing to help to support, feeding efforts for feeding, health hygiene. They do a wonderful big national day of service. every year. And so I think that we're seeing some practical examples of people incorporating the public health guidance as necessary to help kind of bring some continuity to the critical community engagement programs that are going to be necessary to help increasingly more people, I think, navigate some of the challenges that they're faced with the pandemic on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, thank you. So it's been a few months since you wrote that article. So how have you seen the landscape of worship and social connection change in churches specifically over the past few months?
Whew. So as I mentioned, here in DC, we're still all virtual. And I know that as time has gone on, the guidance has changed from state to state. It's different for different people depending on what their risk tolerance is, where they live, and what level of engagement in their church is required at the particular time. I'll say the landscape continues to vary from community to community, denomination to denomination, but there's some interesting work actually coming out of Wheaton College Humanitarian Disaster Institute, which would provide some helpful guidance and considerations for partnership ideas for churches that continue to find that are looking for different ways to reopen. They run a weekly COVID-19 in the church webinar series that I found very helpful there. And I think one of the things that we're continuing to notice is that there's some innovations happening for how they keep groups connected in the small group space, particularly virtually. So I think the immediate challenge when we first wrote that article was, how do you do the big service, right? So depending on your faith, your Friday, Saturday, or Sunday service. And now I think what we're seeing is an evolution towards, okay, how do we help continue to flip what usually is a full service fellowship opportunity to do more small group work, to allow people more opportunity to immerse themselves. I know that folks are zoomed out in many aspects to provide some virtual spaces that feed you in a small group fellowship setting. And so I've been encouraged to see that. I know our church as well, right, has kind of made some of that shift towards not just focusing on those main worship services, but really taking to heart this idea of, we know we're going to be in this position for a while. And unfortunately, some people have comorbidities, or they have health elements, where they're not going to be able to just rush back to the church once the doors are open. So they're trying to create really meaningful engagement opportunities that I find particularly useful and valuable, and I think are going to continue to help kind of inform and influence how the church continues to show up for community members going forward, particularly folks that have kids or people that, again, for whatever reason, may not be able to get back as quickly in physical fellowship with congregates and loved ones. So.
And I know, like, it's the work that we do here at the One America Movement, actually chapter events and doing service projects to increase understanding amongst different congregations, has been hampered by the pandemic as well. And so it just doesn't seem, like it was before, when we're doing in-person meetings and chapter events and stuff like that. And for, a lot of us, we're just doing a lot of our work virtually, but we're really, really, really hoping to get back out there, and hopefully next year by spring or summer. Yeah. So it is definitely difficult to just have relations over Zoom and stuff like that. So
it is. And it's like changing to a healthy eating lifestyle or whatever. If you Diet Coke is not Coke, and I think if we try to convince ourselves of that, we're just going to end up frustrated. I'll say I learned about the work of One America about a year or two ago, actually, and some of the work that you've all done on the ground post disaster, and very much understand, like you said, that there's kind of this urge to want to get out in person. And I think for folks that have kind of confronted what's happening immediately in front of us, and not try to over substitute or say, like, yeah, it's definitely not going to be the same. But I'm also encouraged that you guys, with the Candid Conversations work and some other things, just the work that you all are doing to help find ways to keep some community together. But I agree that I will be glad to serve in person in the coming weeks and hopefully months ahead, and not years. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's coworkers I have not met yet in person. Yeah. I'm looking forward to meeting, some of them, all of them, actually, not some of them. So as we work through this uncertain time in our country, what are your hopes for the future? And that's a big question, but
that is a big question. So my hope for the future is that our nation's leaders and influencers will begin to contribute to environments that move more people to act out of a place of love than a place of fear. In their day-to-day lives. I think, unfortunately, the polarized nature of our world, and in some ways, while we are getting to know the neighbors immediately next to us, we're talking about physical proximity. I think it's been that there's been some othering. There's been a fear of the stranger or a fear of the other that we need to overcome. And if we can confront the brutal facts that the impact our lives, the impact that has been in our lives, like I think that it may be easier to find and focus on acts and gestures and deeds that manifest a more perfect union. I look to the words of former President Barack Obama, who talked about the work of perfecting our union is never finished. And, again, coming out of, I think, a very hard campaign season and looking to some very big challenges,
Mm-hmm.
knowing and just having some humility that we are just, this is another page in the chapter of our country. Encourages and inspires me to keep trying to show up to be an active and enthusiastic contributor toward the common good. No amount of elections are going to change the fact that we're going to have neighbors. Most of us
Yep.
want to live a safe, happy, healthy, fulfilled life, and there's always going to be room to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly in all aspects of our lives. And so that opportunity to choose and making sure that I'm mindful of the stories around me are the things that kind of give me hope, and I think bring hope in. And I'll say again, I think that there's a lot of attention that's paid. I think we're outsized focus on some of the things that are the big headlines and 24-hour news cycles. There's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of wonderful leadership happening at the community level that we have the opportunity to amplify. And I want to be a committed champion to amplify that work, including the work of your organization that you all do. I think that those are going to be the type of things that help bridge some opportunities to help reframe where we're starting our conversations from, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
just, coming through the frame that I think people have been accustomed to throughout this campaign season.
Oh, that's perfect. And I think going back to one of your previous points about working, figure out, talking to your neighbors and finding out who they are and building more community, I hope that people can sort of understand that we do have more in common than, than we don't have. So I think what builds us or brings us together is much more stronger and plentiful than what is actually tearing us apart. So I think this whole pandemic, one of the bright points during the pandemic is that people can see that their next door neighbor isn't the enemy and they're not the other, they're them, So
Yeah.
I think I hope that this sort of blossoms into something much more beautiful and productive for our country in the future.
Yeah, no, I hope it does too. I think it can. I'll say that the thing that we have to our advantage is folks love to eat together in fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's going to be some opportunities when outside opens and folks can get around, that we can create some opportunities to break bread in a constructive way and be honest about it. I think I go back to, again, even when we talk about keeping the faith, having that empathy for yourself and just being able to say, there's times where I was afraid. There may have been times that I didn't know what to do. I think that kind of transparency and openness provides some opportunity to connect. But I know you have to have folks that are willing to do that. And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, I think what we have seen is that leadership matters, and that it's going to be critically important for not just, again, not the formal titles of government leaders, but our nation's leaders overall, to really reinforce that we do want to create that environment for folks to show up from a place of empathy and understanding, before just, speaking our position and running to our corner and not being open to anything else that anyone wants to share. So.
Well, thank you so much for participating. Marcus Coleman is a senior associate at HWC, an organization that's bringing everybody together to focus on the common good. Where can we find you on the internet?
The interwebs. So I am most active on LinkedIn and Twitter. So Twitter handle MT Coleman JR. And then on LinkedIn, I'm pretty active there. I share a lot of work that's happening. So that's the place and space to find me. And appreciate you all for having me on, and for the work that, again, you all continue to do. I think in a lot of ways, One America Movement is really laying the foundation for when we have to make that big pivot in culture change, to helping to really shift the culture toward a more constructive environment to help reach toward a more perfect union. So I appreciate the work that you do, Ryan, and just the things that you all continue to build in the background, and look forward to meeting you in person one day, hopefully. So
Definitely. I would love to get back to DC and just talk your head off, because I really enjoyed this conversation and what you had to say, and your just level of fluency and all of this is amazing. So thank you for sharing your ideas, and I hope that everything works out for everybody in our country, and we actually come together and build a more prosperous union, right?
absolutely. Thank you.
And I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in to today's Candid Conversations. You can find us at www.oneamericamovement.org. And you can also find us on Twitter at OneAmericaMVMT. And yeah, so thanks for everybody for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing everybody in the future.
All righty. Take care, everybody.
All right. Thanks.